Picture this, it's 1952 and Britain is still recovering from the war. Rationing has only just ended, petrol is precious, and the average working man is looking for something practical, economical, and, dare we say it, cheerful. Enter the Austin A30, a car so modest in its ambitions that it would become one of the most successful small cars Britain ever produced. Now, I know what you're thinking. We're talking about Austin here, the company that gave us the Mini, the Healey, and a whole catalogue of vehicles that helped define British motoring. But the A30 and its successor, the A35, occupy a special place in that history. These weren't glamorous machines, they weren't powerful, they certainly weren't going to win you any drag races down at the local strip. But what they were was brilliant at their intended purpose, getting ordinary people mobile in an era when car ownership was still something of a luxury. The 1950s were a transformative decade for Britain. The Festival of Britain in 1951 had tried to lift the nation's spirits, and by the middle of the decade, Prime Minister Harold Macmillan would famously declare that Britons had never had it so good. The Austin A30 arrived right at the beginning of this shift, a symbol of optimism, of democratized mobility, of progress. What makes this story fascinating is how a car so simple, so unpretentious, managed to capture the hearts of a nation and even found success abroad. The A30 and A35 weren't just transportation, they were a cultural phenomenon. And yet, there are aspects of their story that even seasoned enthusiasts might not know. So let's dig into 13 facts about these remarkable little Austins that might just surprise you. Fact 1. The A30 was born from wartime innovation. The Austin A30 didn't just appear out of thin air in 1952. Its development was directly influenced by wartime engineering lessons and the need for economy. The Austin Motor Company had spent the war years building military vehicles and aircraft components, and when peace came, they needed to pivot quickly to civilian production. Leonard Lord, who ran Austin at the time, was obsessed with creating a small car that could compete with the Morris Minor. Ironic, considering Austin and Morris would merge just a few years later to form BMC. The A30 used a unitary construction method, which was still relatively novel in British small car production. This meant the body and chassis were integrated as one structure, making the car lighter and more rigid than traditional body-on-frame designs. The engineering team was led by a group of designers who had cut their teeth during the war, and their focus was ruthlessly practical. Maximum interior space, minimum exterior dimensions, and above all, fuel economy. Remember, Britain in the early 50s still had fuel rationing, and every mile per gallon mattered. Fact 2. The original price was astonishingly low. When the Austin A30 launched in late 1951 for the 1952 model year, it carried a price tag of just £507, 17 shillings and sixpence in the UK. To put that in perspective, the average annual wage for a British worker at the time was around £400. Yes, the car cost more than a year's wages, but it was still within reach of the aspirational working class, especially with hire purchase agreements becoming more common. By the time the improved A35 arrived in 1956, the base price had risen to £568. This still represented remarkable value. For comparison, a Morris Minor at the same time cost about the same, while a Ford Popular, a truly basic machine, was slightly cheaper but felt it. Fact 3. The engine was tiny but tough. Under the bonnet of the original A30 sat an 803 cubic centimetre overhead valve, four-cylinder engine producing just 30 horsepower. 30! In modern terms, that's barely enough to power a decent lawnmower. Yet this little engine, designated the A-Series, would become one of the most important power plants in British automotive history. The genius of the A-Series wasn't in its power, it was in its flexibility and durability. This engine block in various displacements would go on to power Minis, MG Midgets, Austin Healey Sprites, and countless other vehicles well into the 1980s, We're talking about an engine that remained in production in various forms for over 4 decades. When the A35 launched in 1956, Austin bored the engine out to 948 cubic centimeters, increasing power to 34 horsepower. Still not earth-shattering, but that extra displacement and 4 horsepower made a noticeable difference in drivability, particularly when fully loaded or climbing hills. Fact 4, top speed was. Optimistic Austin claimed the A30 could reach 62 miles per hour flat out. Period road tests suggested the reality was closer to 58 or 59 miles per hour, and that was with a following wind and a lot of patience. The A35, with its larger engine, could genuinely achieve 65 miles per hour, making it noticeably more capable on Britain's improving road network. But here's the thing, top speed wasn't really the point. These cars were designed for journeys of 20 to 30 miles, pottering around town, the occasional weekend trip to the coast. The Motor magazine tested an A30 in 1952 and achieved 41 miles per gallon. That was the real selling point. You could drive all week on a couple of gallons of petrol. Fact 5. Over 500,000 were built. Here's where the numbers get impressive. Austin produced 223,330 A30s between 1951 and 1956. Then they built 263,518 A35s between 1956 and 1959. That's nearly 500,000 cars from a model line that many people today have forgotten. To appreciate these numbers, consider that the entire British motor industry in 1952 produced just under 500,000 cars total. The A30 represented a significant chunk of that production, and by the mid-50s, Austin was one of the largest car manufacturers in Britain. These weren't just sold at home either. The A30 and A35 were exported worldwide, to Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and even to the United States, though American sales were modest. The car's reliability and economy made it popular in developing markets where fuel was expensive and repair facilities were basic. Fact 6. The van version was a commercial success. While the saloon versions get most of the attention, Austin also produced a van variant that became hugely popular with small businesses. The Austin A35 van, with its blanked-off rear windows and fold-flat passenger seat, could carry a surprising amount of cargo for its diminutive size. Post offices used them, bakers used them, telegram delivery services used them. These little vans became part of the fabric of British commercial life in the 50s. They could navigate narrow streets that larger vans struggled with, they were cheap to run, and they were reliable enough that a small business owner could depend on them day in, day out. The van version cost slightly less than the saloon because it had fewer luxury features, no rear seat, simpler trim, making it even more accessible to working people trying to start their own businesses in the more prosperous late 50s. Fact 7. Racing success nobody expected. Here's something that surprises people. The Austin A30 and A35 had a modest but genuine competition career. No, they weren't winning Le Mans, but in national and club-level racing, particularly in saloon car categories, these little Austins punched above their weight. The A35 was particularly popular in production car trials and rallies. Its lightweight and surprisingly robust mechanicals meant that, in the right hands, it could be competitive in events where outright power mattered less than reliability and handling. The Australian Alpine Rally saw A35s competing regularly, and they performed credibly. Several tuning companies offered performance upgrades. You could extract 45 or even 50 horsepower from the 948 cubic centimeter engine with the right modifications: twin carburetors, a hotter camshaft, a free-flowing exhaust. That doesn't sound like much, but in a car weighing just under 1,600 pounds, it made a genuine difference. Fact 8. The Countryman was ahead of its time. In 1954, Austin introduced the A30 Countryman, essentially an estate car version with a distinctive half-timbered look created by wood trim along the sides. This might sound gimmicky now, but it was remarkably practical. The split rear door opened to reveal a surprisingly usable cargo area, and with the rear seats folded, you could carry a respectable amount of luggage or goods. The Countryman presaged the modern concept of the small estate car or hatchback, a vehicle that combined the economy of a small car with genuine practicality. For young families in the 50s, this was a revelation. You could afford to run it, you could park it easily, and yet you could still pack it full for a holiday to Cornwall or a trip to visit the in-laws. The A35 Countryman continued this tradition and became even more popular. By the late 50s, estates were beginning to lose their commercial stigma and become acceptable for suburban family use. And the A35 Countryman was perfectly positioned to capitalize on that shift. Fact 9. They lasted forever. With care. Ask anyone who owned an A30 or A35 and they'll tell you the same thing. These cars were fundamentally reliable. The A-series engine was virtually unburstable if you changed the oil regularly. The gearbox was simple and robust. The electrical system, while basic, was straightforward enough that most owners could troubleshoot problems themselves. The weakness? Rust. British cars of this era were not rust-proof to modern standards. Actually, they were barely rust-proofed at all. The A30 and A35 could rot from the inside out if not properly maintained. Sills, inner wings, floor pans, all were vulnerable. A car that ran perfectly could be condemned by corrosion eating through the unitary body structure. This is why, despite nearly 500,000 being built, surviving examples are relatively rare today. Many simply rusted away in the damp British climate. The cars that survived were typically garaged or exported to drier climates like Australia or South Africa, or lovingly maintained by dedicated owners who understood the importance of keeping water out and treating every spot of surface rust immediately. Fact 10. The interior was surprisingly spacious. Climb inside an A30 or A35 today, and you might be surprised. Despite the tiny exterior dimensions, the car was just 12 feet long, the interior feels roomy for 4 adults. This was intentional. The designers maximized interior space by pushing the wheels to the corners and keeping the mechanical components compact. The dashboard was simple but complete, a speedometer, a fuel gauge, and a few warning lights. The later A35s gained a slightly more modern dash layout, but the emphasis remained on simplicity and functionality. Seats were basic but comfortable enough for journeys of moderate length. The driving position was upright, giving a good view of the road, which helped with the car's maneuverability in traffic. This efficient packaging was part of what made these cars so popular. You could park them in spaces that defeated larger vehicles, you could navigate narrow lanes with confidence, and yet you didn't feel cramped or punished for choosing economy. Oversize? Fact 11. Current values reflect forgotten status. Here's something that might surprise modern collectors. A30s and A35s remain relatively affordable. While the classic car market has inflated prices for many British classics, Minis, MG Midgets, Triumph Spitfires, the humble Austin has largely been overlooked. A presentable, running A35 might fetch £3,000 to £6,000 in the UK market today. Even Concours examples rarely crack £10,000. Compare that to a comparable Morris Minor, which can easily command £8,000 to £12,000 for a nice example, and you start to see how undervalued these Austins are. Why the disparity? Partly its name recognition. The Morris Minor has achieved iconic status that the A30 and A35 never quite managed. Partly its aesthetics. The Minor's curves are generally considered more attractive than the Austin's more upright styling. But for anyone looking to enter classic car ownership affordably, an A35 represents genuine value. They're cheap to maintain, parts are still available through specialist suppliers, and running costs are minimal. Fact 12. They influenced Japanese car design. Here's a connection that isn't widely discussed. The Austin A30 and A35 had a direct influence on early Japanese automotive development. In the 1950s, Japan was in the early stages of rebuilding its motor industry, and British cars represented the standard for what a small, economical vehicle should be. Several Japanese manufacturers studied British small cars intensively, and Austin had licensing agreements that saw the A30 and A35 produced in Japan by Nissan. The engineering principles, efficient packaging, simple mechanicals, emphasis on economy over performance would echo through Japanese car design for decades. It's not too much of a stretch to suggest that the DNA of the Austin A series engine and the principles embodied in the A30 and A35 influenced the thinking that would eventually produce cars like the Toyota Corolla and Nissan Sunny, vehicles that conquered global markets using many of the same basic principles Leonard Lord's engineers had pioneered in 1951. Fact 13. They represent a lost philosophy of motoring. Perhaps the most important thing to understand about the Austin A30 and A35 is what they represented philosophically. These were cars designed around the idea that motoring should be accessible, economical, and practical. There was no pretension, no attempt to make them something they weren't. In our modern era of ever-growing vehicles, even small cars are larger and heavier than mid-size sedans of the past. The A30 and A35 remind us that you don't need 2 tons of metal and 200 horsepower to meet most people's actual transportation needs. These cars did everything most drivers required. They got you to work, they carried your family, they managed the weekly shopping, and they didn't bankrupt you in the process. That philosophy has been lost in modern automotive design, where even economy cars are burdened with safety equipment, emissions controls, and consumer expectations that push them ever larger and more complex. The A30 and A35 came from an era when a car was a tool, not a status symbol or a rolling entertainment center. The Austin A30 and A35 aren't glamorous classics. They won't make your pulse race or turn heads at car shows. But they represent something arguably more important: honest, well-engineered transportation that served millions of people during a transformative era in British social history. Nearly 500,000 of these cars were built, and they transported countless families on countless journeys, daily commutes, weekend trips, holiday adventures. They were present at the beginning of Britain's post-war prosperity, and they helped make car ownership a realistic aspiration for ordinary working people. For those of us who appreciate automotive history, the A30 and A35 deserve recognition not for what they achieved on the racetrack or in the marketplace against exotic competition, but for what they represented: democratic mobility, practical engineering, and honest value. If you've owned or driven an A30 or A35, I'd love to hear about your experiences in the comments. What memories do you have of these little Austins? And if you've never encountered one, perhaps this video has given you a new appreciation for a car that deserves to be remembered. If you found this deep dive interesting, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button. It helps us continue exploring the forgotten corners of automotive history and bringing you stories about the cars that really mattered, even if they didn't get the glory. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.